I stood frozen in front of my bedroom door, the door locked from the inside. And from behind that wood, I heard sounds I had never heard from my wife in 34 years of marriage. I knocked. No one answered. I called her name. My voice trembled with each heartbeat. Then I heard hurried footsteps, a man's whisper, the sound of a zipper being pulled. In that moment, I understood one thing. What was about to shatter was not just a marriage. It was the entire life I had trusted for nearly 3.5 decades. I didn't shout. I didn't break the door down right away. I stepped back, and in my mind, a cold decision began to take shape. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps the story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. My name is Marcus Washington. Everyone calls me Mark, 65 years old, an African-American man, retired with more salt than pepper in my hair, living in a quiet suburb just outside Atlanta, Georgia, where people still sit on their porches in the evening and neighbors wave to each other every morning. I had lived in that house for more than 28 years. I knew every creak of the hardwood floor, which board made which sound when you stepped on it, which window rattled when the summer storms rolled through. And in all my 34 years as a husband, not once had I stood in front of my own bedroom door like this. I came home earlier than usual for a very simple reason. A reason so harmless that if I could go back to that morning, I would make the exact same decision. That morning, I had a routine health checkup at a clinic near Buckhead. Just blood work and a blood pressure check, things a man my age has to get used to. The doctor said everything looked fine and even joked that I should enjoy retirement instead of worrying like a 40-year-old man. I walked out of the clinic nearly 2 hours earlier than expected. On the way home, I stopped by the familiar bakery on Peachtree Street, a small shop that sold peach cobbler and sweet potato pie. Denise, my wife, had always liked warm peach cobbler with a cup of black coffee in the afternoon. I remembered that clearly. I had remembered it for decades. I thought to myself, why not go home early today, buy some cobbler, make coffee, and sit together on the back deck like we used to. A normal afternoon. Calm. The true meaning of the word family. I parked the car in the carport, turned off the engine, and stepped out with a bag of pastries in my hand. Nothing seemed unusual. No television noise, no music coming from the kitchen. I thought Denise might be resting in the bedroom. She had been getting headaches lately. I opened the front door and stepped inside. And in that exact moment, a strange feeling washed over me. Not immediate fear, but something that felt wrong. The house was quiet in an unusual way. Not the familiar quiet of a peaceful afternoon, but a tense silence as if the house itself was holding its breath. I called her name. Denise. No answer. I set the bag down on the kitchen counter. The wall clock ticked loudly, each second clear and sharp. I started down the hallway. Each step echoed beneath my feet as if trying to warn me not to keep going. But I kept going. I called her name again, louder. Still no response. Then I heard the sound. At first, it was very faint. So faint, I almost thought I had imagined it. A quickened breath, a suppressed moan. I froze mid-step. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I took another step, then another. The sound became clearer, no longer vague, no longer uncertain. It was coming from my bedroom. Our bedroom. I had slept in that room for more than 28 years. I knew every sound it made. I knew how Denise shifted in her sleep. I knew the sound of the spring storms tapping against the window. But this sound, I had never heard it. Not from her. Not like this. I stood in front of the door. I placed my hand on the doorknob and turned it gently. It didn't open. Locked from the inside. I stood there, my hands still on the knob, my mind completely blank. In 34 years of marriage, we had never locked the bedroom door on each other. Never. Not during arguments, not during silent weeks. That door had always been open, always a place I could enter any time. I knocked softly, then harder. Denise, no response. I called her name again. My voice shook, not from anger, but from a fear that had not yet fully taken shape. And then from inside, I heard hurried footsteps. A man's whisper, very quiet, but clear enough for me to know it wasn't my imagination. Then I heard the sound of a zipper. Short, rushed, unmistakable dot in that moment. Everything inside me froze. I didn't break the door down. I didn't shout. I didn't do any of the things angry men in movies usually do. I stood there silently, and within those few seconds, I felt a strange shift inside myself. The initial shock, a feeling like someone had punched me straight in the chest, slowly gave way to something else. Cold, very cold, as if all emotion had drained out, leaving only raw clarity. I listened. Each second stretched beyond measure. I heard the whispers fade, footsteps moving around the room, the rustle of bed sheets. Each sound carved deeper into something I still didn't dare name. I suddenly realized that if I broke the door down at that moment, I would never forget what was on the other side. And there are images that once burned into your mind never leave. I let go of the doorknob. I stepped back, then another step. I turned and walked down the hallway, one step at a time, slow and careful, as if moving any faster would cause me to shatter right there. I went into the kitchen, grabbed my jacket, took my car keys. I didn't look around. I didn't call her name again. I left the house in silence, leaving behind a locked door and a question so large I wasn't ready to face it. Sitting in the car, my hands on the steering wheel, I realized I was shaking. Not from the cold, but because I was holding myself together by force. I took a deep breath, very deep. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know how I would face this. But there was one thing I knew for certain, clearer than anything else in my life at that moment. Nothing would ever be the same again. I sat in the car for a long time after leaving the house. I didn't start the engine. I didn't turn on the radio. I just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if the road in front of me might offer an answer. But instead of driving anywhere, my memories pulled me far back to where all my beliefs were formed, to how I had believed in marriage, in lifelong commitment, in the woman I had called my wife for more than 30 years. I was born and raised in the South, in a small town outside Birmingham, Alabama, where life moved slowly and people knew each other across generations. My father worked in construction, a quiet man with broad shoulders and hands that always smelled of concrete dust and motor oil. He wasn't the type to show emotion, but I never once saw him break a promise to my mother. Every morning he woke before dawn, drank black coffee in silence, then drove his old pickup to the job site. Every afternoon, right on time, he came home, hung his jacket on the hook, washed his hands at the back sink, and sat down at the dinner table. That my mother was different. She talked more, laughed more, and always knew how to keep the house warm, no matter how harsh the winter outside was. They didn't always get along. I had seen them argue, heard sharp words echo through the kitchen. But one thing never changed. They never betrayed each other. In my world back then, fidelity wasn't a lofty concept. It was simply how things worked. Marriage was a promise, and a promise had to be kept. I grew up with that belief so deeply ingrained that I never questioned it. As a teenager, I wasn't romantic. I didn't write love letters or dream of passionate affairs. I just believed that one day I would meet a woman, marry her, work hard, build a home, and stay together until the end. To me, Marriage wasn't something that needed constant proof through words or emotional fireworks. It was presence. It was being there day after day. I met Denise when we were both very young. I was 23, just starting my first job in construction management. Denise worked as a receptionist for a law firm downtown. We met at a mutual friend's cookout, a small backyard gathering, music playing from an old boombox, people standing around in small groups talking. I don't remember what I said to her first. I only remember that she smiled. A smile that wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but one that made me want to stay and talk longer. Denise wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room, but she had a calm presence that felt comforting. The way she listened, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the way she never interrupted others, it all made me feel safe in a way I couldn't quite explain. We talked about ordinary things, work, family, where we grew up. There was no lightning strike, no cinematic moment. But when I left that night, I realized I remembered her voice very clearly. We started dating slowly. Evenings at small restaurants, weekends at the movies, long conversations in the car, parked outside her place because neither of us wanted to go inside yet. I never had to guess what Denise was thinking. She was straightforward, clear, and didn't like playing games. That made me trust her. I liked knowing where I stood in someone else's life. Our years of dating were quiet. No dramatic breakups and reunions, no tests or theatrics. We argued, yes, but we always talked afterward. I never doubted Denise's sincerity, and I think that was why I loved her, because with her, I didn't have to be on guard. Our wedding took place on an autumn afternoon. The sky was clear, the breeze light, leaves just beginning to change color. It was a simple ceremony at the local church. Standing at the altar, I remember exactly how I felt. Not nervous, not afraid, just a calm certainty. When I said my vows, I didn't think of them as poetic words. I thought of them as obvious truths. That I would stand by her, that I would be faithful, that we would grow old together. After the wedding, our lives quickly settled into the familiar rhythm of young married couples. I worked more. Denise continued her job. We saved to buy a house. There were months when money was tight, days when we were too tired to do more than eat dinner in silence. But I never thought that was a problem. To me, marriage was responsibility, stability, doing what needed to be done, even when it wasn't pleasant. I believed that if I fulfilled my duties, earned money, stayed faithful, showed up when needed, everything else would fall into place. I believed sacrifice was a natural part of being a husband. I believed emotions didn't always need to be spoken because actions mattered more. And most of all, I believed there should be no secrets between husband and wife. All those years, I never checked Denise's phone, never asked who she was texting, never doubted her when she said she was going out with friends or staying late for work. Not because I was naive, but because in my world, those things weren't necessary. If you were married, trust was the default, not something negotiated every day. Denise never gave me a reason to doubt her. She didn't hide things, didn't act suspicious. At least that's what I believed. And I was proud of that. Proud that I was a husband who wasn't jealous or controlling. I thought that was the mark of a healthy marriage. Now sitting in my car and looking back, I was beginning to realize an uncomfortable truth. My absolute trust wasn't just a strength. It was also a blind spot. I had believed in marriage the way I learned from my parents, from the environment I grew up in, from old but solid values. But I never questioned them, never checked, never looked to see if the other person was still standing in the same place. I had never suspected Denise, not once. And that, when I think of the locked door in my own house, has become the most painful thing of all. Not long after the wedding, life truly began to test us. The early years of marriage were far from easy, not like I had imagined. Money was the first challenge. I was just starting out in construction management, with a modest salary and bonuses that fluctuated month to month. There were periods when I worked relentlessly and still struggled to make ends meet, staring at my paycheck at the end of the month with a knot in my stomach. Denise didn't have it much better. Her receptionist job was stable, but the pay barely covered basic expenses. We lived in a small rented apartment with low ceilings, drafty in winter, stifling in summer. Our furniture wasn't worth much. An old couch bought secondhand, a wobbly dining table, and a bed that creaked every time we turned over. But I didn't feel poor back then. I felt like we were just passing through a phase. Every newlywed went through it, right? I threw myself into work with a simple determination. Do better, earn more, so Denise wouldn't have to worry. I took extra shifts, extra projects, drove hundreds of miles just to close small contracts. I believed that was what a man was supposed to do. Carry the weight. Be the support. Denise gradually took on everything else. She managed the house, tracked expenses, handled meals. I came home late, often eating reheated food, and never complained. Denise didn't either. She just asked if I was tired, then quietly cleared the dishes. I mistook that silence for understanding. We saved every dollar. No vacations, no luxuries. Every month, we set aside a small amount for a bigger goal, buying a house. I remember clearly the day we signed the contract for our first home. A modest ranch-style house in the suburbs. Not big, not new, but ours. I stood in the empty living room that day, placed my hand on the wall, and felt like I had accomplished something monumental. Denise cried. I didn't, but inside I felt a quiet pride. I thought, I'm doing this right. I believed that house was proof of what I had sacrificed, of the long hours, the endless drives, and Isaiah was born. The day Denise gave birth, I stood in the hospital waiting area, clutching the paper with the doctor's name, torn between fear and excitement. When the nurse brought him out, red-faced and crying loudly, something inside me changed forever. I looked at my son and silently promised that he would never lack the way I once had. I would do whatever it took to give him a full life. A few years later, Jasmine was born. The house filled with laughter, toys scattered across the floor, sleepless nights with fevers and crying. Denise stayed home more. I worked more. Everything happened naturally, almost without discussion. I believed it was a fair division. I earned the money. Denise took care of the family in those years. I was often away from home. Not because I didn't want to be with my wife and children, but because I believed I had to be. I left early and came home late. Some weeks I only had dinner with my family once or twice. I missed a few birthdays, a few parent-teacher meetings, a few of Isaiah's basketball games. But every time I told myself, I'm doing this for the family. Denise didn't blame me. At least she didn't say it out loud. She handled everything at home, from meals, clothes, and the kids' homework to small things like changing light bulbs or calling a repairman when the washing machine broke. I thought she was strong. I thought she understood, and there were many happy moments too. Weekend nights when the whole family ate fried chicken and watched movies together. Short camping trips when Isaiah and Jasmine were still little, running around the woods while Denise and I sat on folding chairs drinking sweet tea. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas evenings, the house filled with voices and laughter, the smell of collard greens and cornbread spreading through the kitchen. In those moments, I looked around and thought, I did it. I thought I was a good husband, a responsible father. I thought I had fulfilled my role, but there were very small things that, looking back now, I finally recognize. There were evenings when Denise sat alone in the kitchen, the light falling on her hair, while I had just gotten home, exhausted, only wanting to shower and sleep. She asked me something about my day, and I answered vaguely. There were times she talked about the kids, about very ordinary worries, and I listened while my mind was already on the next day's work. I didn't do that because I didn't care. I did it because I thought those things weren't urgent. I believed my priority was making sure everything kept running smoothly. I thought emotions could wait. Distance doesn't come from one big event. It comes very slowly, like water seeping into a foundation, little by little, without making a sound. I didn't notice when we started talking less. I didn't notice when deeper conversations were replaced by short questions. Have you eaten? I'll be home late tomorrow. I didn't notice when Denise began to fall silent more often. I believed a strong marriage didn't need constant talking. I believed that after so many years together, everything was understood automatically. I believed stability was enough. And I was wrong. At that time, I didn't see the distance. I only saw a household that functioned, a family that lacked nothing, children growing up healthy. I focused on what was visible and ignored what couldn't be seen. 34 years passed like that. One year stacked on top of another, forming a life I believed was solid. I had no idea that while I was busy building walls and roofs, somewhere between us, a crack was quietly opening, large enough eventually for someone else to step through. The distance didn't arrive loudly. It didn't knock. It didn't warn me. It came silently, just like the way Denise began to change. Little by little, small enough for me to ignore, slow enough for me to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. At first, it was her appearance. Denise began paying more attention to herself. Not a sudden change, but small details that I probably wouldn't have noticed if we hadn't lived together for decades. She cut her hair shorter, changed the style. Before, Denise always wore her hair in natural braids or pulled back neatly at home. Now it was styled differently, straightened with volume, taking more time each morning. I remember once walking into the bathroom and noticing a new perfume, very light, not strong, but not the one Denise had used for years. She bought new clothes more often, not expensive ones, but items she rarely chose before, fitted dresses that showed her figure, brighter colors, heels instead of her usual flats. I complimented her. I truly did. I said she looked good younger. Denise just smiled, a quick smile, then turned away to do something else. I thought it was a good thing. I thought maybe now that the kids were grown and out of the house, she was rediscovering herself. I even felt proud, as if that change reflected a full life, not a lack. Denise's daily routine slowly changed as well. She wasn't home as much as before. On the rare afternoons when I came home early, the house was empty. Denise said she was out with friends, or taking walks, or attending some class at the community center. I didn't ask for details. I believed a woman at that age needed her own world. I thought I shouldn't control her. Once I joked, "You've been pretty busy lately." Denise replied lightly, "I don't want to sit around all day." I nodded. I didn't see anything wrong with that. I thought I understood. And when something inside me stirred slightly, a very vague feeling hard to name, I immediately pushed it down. I reassured myself. I told myself I was overthinking, that we had been together for more than 30 years. There was no reason to doubt anything now, that these thoughts were signs of aging, of baseless insecurity. Then Troy moved into the house next door. I remember very clearly the first day I met him. One Saturday morning, I was trimming the hedges when I saw a rental truck parked in front of the neighbor's house. A man much younger than me was carrying boxes inside, tall, muscular, dressed in athletic gear. When he noticed me, he smiled and greeted me first. "I'm Troy," he said friendly, "just moved in." I shook his hand, introduced myself, exchanged a few polite words. Nothing remarkable. Troy worked as a personal trainer, mostly from home with online clients, so he was often around. Polite, quiet, not troublesome, the kind of neighbor anyone would consider lucky to have. Denise met Troy not long after. I wasn't there at the time, but she mentioned it casually at dinner. Troy needed to borrow a few small tools. Denise said he seemed nice, easy to talk to. I listened and nodded. Nothing unusual. Gradually, Troy appeared more often in Denise's casual stories. He asked about her health. He complained about living alone, not being used to cooking. Denise laughed and said she had shown him a few simple dishes. Once she brought a plate of leftover food over to his place, saying she had cooked too much. I didn't see anything suspicious. I believed in kindness. I believed neighbors helping each other was normal. I had lived my whole life believing most people were good, that not every action carried hidden motives. The conversations between Denise and Troy, as far as I could see, were harmless. Sometimes I came home and saw them standing in the driveway talking at a reasonable distance. No intimate gestures, no suspicious looks. At least that's what I thought. I greeted Troy. He greeted me back. Everything looked normal. But there were very small details that I didn't connect at the time. Denise seemed more animated when talking about Troy than when talking about other things. Her voice brightened slightly, moved a bit faster. Not enough for me to draw conclusions, but enough that looking back, I wonder why I didn't notice Dot at the same time. Denise began complaining about me more. She said I was always tired, that I didn't listen like I used to, that I was always in my own world, even after retirement. She said we didn't really talk anymore. These things weren't said in anger, but in a weary tone. And because of that, I didn't know how to respond. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I didn't explain much either. I stayed silent, thinking things would settle on their own. I believed that after so many years, a few complaints were inevitable. I thought if I didn't make a big deal out of it, it would pass. Once, Denise said directly, "You're always there, but you're not really with me." I heard that and felt something deep inside me get touched, but I said nothing. I didn't know how to answer. I had been there. I had worked. I had built the house. I had raised the kids. I hadn't cheated. To me, that was enough. I chose silence over conversation. Not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, I would say the wrong thing. I was afraid of making things worse. I believed that peace, even surface-level peace, was better than confrontation. So I kept doing what I had always done, trusting. Trusting that Denise wouldn't cross a certain line. Trusting that Troy was just a polite neighbor. Trusting that kindness didn't come with betrayal. Trusting that 34 years was long enough not to need vigilance. I chose to ignore those signs, not because I didn't see them, but because I didn't want to believe they meant anything. And that choice later became the thing I regretted the most. I thought that if I stayed silent, if I kept trusting, everything would return to its old path. I believed Denise's complaints were just fatigue from aging, a shaky phase after the kids had their own lives. I believed Troy's presence was just a small detail in the quiet picture of the neighborhood. But intuition, the thing I had dismissed my entire life, began screaming inside me day after day, loud enough that I could no longer pretend not to hear it. It started with the phone. Denise had never been overly attached to her phone. She used it to call the kids, text friends, check the news. Usually, it lay on the kitchen counter, on the table next to the couch, or charging on the nightstand. She didn't carry it everywhere like younger people do. Then one day, I realized Denise's phone was no longer just somewhere in the house. It was always in her purse, her pants pocket, or placed face down on the table. When I walked into a room, she would pick it up reflexively. as if it were something precious that needed protecting. Not obvious, not panicked, but fast enough to make me feel like a stranger stepping into her private space. I told myself, she's probably reading the news and doesn't want to be disturbed. I tried to smile at myself, mocking my own sensitivity and old age, but it kept happening. And what unsettled me wasn't just the action. It was the feeling that Denise was hiding something from me. Once while she was in the shower, her phone vibrated on the kitchen table. Just once, briefly. The screen lit up. I didn't mean to look, I swear, but the name on the screen hit me like a slap. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stood by the sink holding a dish towel and suddenly didn't know how to breathe. The phone vibrated again, then stopped. I stared at it for several long seconds. A part of me wanted to pick it up, to know what they were saying, to free myself from this hanging uncertainty. But another part of me, the part that had lived its entire life by principles, stopped me. I didn't touch it. I put the towel down and walked out of the kitchen as if I hadn't seen anything. When Denise came out, she glanced quickly at the phone and picked it up right away. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. That night, while we were watching TV, I noticed Denise texting. Her fingers moved faster than usual. Then, after a few minutes, she opened the messages, scrolled, and deleted them cleanly, naturally, like a habit. I stared at the TV, but I saw nothing. I only heard the sound of blood rushing in my ears. I asked myself, who deletes messages if there's nothing to hide? But immediately, another voice in my head pushed back. Don't become that suspicious man. Don't turn something small into a storm dot in the days that followed. I started paying more attention, even though I hated the feeling. I hated having to watch my wife like a stranger. I hated sneaking, guessing, doubting. But once intuition wakes up, it doesn't go back to sleep easily. Denise took her phone into the bathroom. Denise stepped outside to answer calls. Denise turned her body to shield the screen when I walked over. Small things that once meant nothing now became needles pricking my skin. Then I found the note. Not in a dramatic moment. Not because I was snooping. I hated that idea. I wasn't the kind of man who dug through his wife's drawers, but that day I was folding laundry. Denise had left clean clothes on the bed, and I carried them to the closet like I always had, a habit from the days when she was busy with small children. When I pulled open a drawer to put away a few sweaters, I saw a small piece of paper caught between two layers of fabric. It was folded in half, like someone had stuffed it there in a hurry. I meant to ignore it, but it slipped to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and before I could think, I opened it. Just a few lines, handwritten. Today was special. Thank you for everything. T. The handwriting was slanted, the pen strokes firm, not Denise's, and the initial at the end, a single T like a seal. I stood motionless, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. In my head, everything spun. T, Troy, or some other name starting with T, but in Denise's life, I knew almost all her friends. There was no one close enough to write something that intimate. And the phrase, today was special, didn't sound like something from a casual friend. A sharp pain shot through my chest, as if someone had squeezed my heart. I had to sit down on the edge of the bed. I sat there staring at the note, and the pain wasn't just in my chest. It spread up to my throat. I swallowed, but nothing went down. I breathed, but it felt difficult. I remember folding the note back up. I put it back exactly where I found it. Not because I wanted to pretend I didn't know, but because I was suddenly afraid. Afraid that if I took it downstairs and confronted Denise then I would hear a smooth lie, or worse, I would hear the truth before I was ready to endure it. Walked out of the room like a sleepwalker. I went downstairs to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and washed my hands even though they weren't dirty. I looked out into the backyard, where the trees were gently swaying in the breeze. Everything out there was still normal. The sky was still blue. Birds were still singing. The world was still moving at its usual pace. Only I was standing in the wrong place in my own life. From that day on, I started paying closer attention, not in an obvious stalking way, but in the way of a man trying to hold on to his dignity until the very end. I began to notice Denise's schedule. She said she was going to the store, and I noticed how long she was gone. She said she was meeting a friend, and I wondered why she needed to dress up so carefully just to have coffee with a friend. I started noticing suspicious coincidences in timing. Every time I left the house in the morning to exercise or run errands, Troy seemed to step outside at the same time. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but then it happened again and again. Troy worked from home, so why did he so often go out right when I left? And why were there days when I came back earlier than expected and saw Troy's car parked differently than usual, as if he had just rushed home? There were afternoons when Denise said she was going for a walk around the neighborhood, and coincidentally, Troy went out at the same time. They stood on the sidewalk between the two houses talking for a few minutes. When I stepped onto the porch, they separated almost reflexively. Not too obvious, but fast enough to make me feel like I had just interrupted something. Every night, I lay next to Denise, listening to her breathing. And in the darkness, I battled with myself. I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe I was imagining things. I wanted to believe that the note meant nothing, that the letter T wasn't what I thought it was. Because if it wasn't, then my entire life would be split into before and after, and I would never be able to go back. But my intuition wouldn't let go. It reminded me of the locked door, of the sound of the zipper, of a man's whispered voice. It reminded me that those things don't just happen for no reason. And it whispered like a cold voice in my head, "Don't be stupid anymore, Mark." I still couldn't face it. I still couldn't ask Denise directly, not because I was weak, but because I knew that if I asked without having anything concrete in my hands, I would only get a vague answer, a denial, a twist that would turn me into an irrationally suspicious man. And then I would hate myself. I needed proof. That thought didn't come to me like a revenge plan or a dirty scheme. It came as something necessary for me to stay sane. I couldn't live with vague suspicion. I also couldn't destroy my family based on a feeling. If I was going to confront this, I had to confront the truth clearly, undeniably. I remember sitting alone in my car, again one afternoon, parked near Piedmont Park, watching people walk by. I asked myself, if this is true, what will I do? And the only answer I had at that moment was, I won't act rashly. I'll watch. I'll know for sure, because deep down I understood something painful. When a woman starts hiding her phone, deleting messages, keeping a handwritten note with an initial in a drawer, then my absolute trust was no longer a virtue. It had become my greatest weakness, and I couldn't let that weakness destroy the rest of my life. After all those signs, I knew I couldn't keep living in that suspended state any longer. Suspicion is a very poisonous thing. It doesn't kill you immediately, but it eats away at you day after day, night after night, until you no longer recognize yourself. I didn't want to become an old man sitting in his own house, constantly asking himself, am I being deceived? But I also couldn't confront Denise directly. Not yet. Not when all I had were instincts, scattered pieces, and a small note with an initial. I had lived my entire life guided by reason. If I was going to face this, I had to face clear truth. No guessing, no emotional arguments. That thought followed me through many sleepless nights. I lay next to Denise, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the ticking of the clock in the living room echoing down the hallway. Each second felt like it was hammering straight into my head. I knew I was about to do something that, if my fears were true, I would never be able to undo. And then I decided to pretend to go on a business trip. In reality, I was retired. I no longer took long trips like before, but for many years, my work had involved driving to meet clients, attending trade shows, going to meetings. To Denise, me going out of town for a few days was familiar enough not to raise questions, and that was exactly what made my plan both simple and terrifying. I chose to mention it on a very ordinary evening. Dinner that night was nothing special. Denise cooked a familiar chicken dish. We sat across from each other, yellow light falling on the dining table. I ate slowly, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible. Next week, I have to go to Savannah for 2 days. I said as casually as if I were talking about the weather. An old friend asked me to help him with a few things. Denise looked up just for a very brief moment, but long enough for me to see it clearly. Her eyes lit up, not with worry, not with annoyance, but with something else. A very subtle change, very fast, but not completely hidden. "When are you leaving?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Thursday. Early in the morning," I replied, still looking down at my plate, but every sense alert. "When will you be back?" "Friday night or Saturday morning?" "Depends." Denise nodded. "Okay, make sure you bring a warm jacket. It can get cool near the coast." She played her part perfectly, caring, appropriate, but I felt a chill run down my spine. Throughout dinner, Denise seemed relieved. She talked more than usual. She even laughed a few times. Nothing overt, but for a man who had lived with her for more than 30 years, I knew it wasn't random. That night, I barely slept. I listened to Denise turning beside me, listened to her steady breathing, and asked myself, "What are you doing, Mark? You're setting a trap for your own marriage." But it was too late to turn back, because deep down, I understood that if I didn't do this, I would live in darkness forever. On Thursday morning, I did everything exactly like a real trip. I got up early, packed a few sets of clothes into a small suitcase, put my old laptop into a bag. I made coffee and drank it alone in the kitchen. Denise came downstairs, her hair neatly wrapped, wearing a light robe. "Drive safely," she said, placing her hand on my shoulder for a brief moment. The touch was very light, very familiar, but this time it felt strangely distant. I nodded, grabbed my suitcase, and stepped outside. I drove out of the neighborhood, like always, past the familiar corner until I could no longer see my house in the rearview mirror. But instead of continuing on, I turned onto a small road, looped back around, and parked a few blocks away, out of sight. I sat there in the car, my heart pounding. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something wrong. Not because it was illegal, but because it went against everything I believed in. I wasn't a stalker. I wasn't a suspicious man. But at that moment, I had no other choice. I waited. The first 10 minutes passed slowly. I checked my watch, then looked out the window. Nothing happened. I started thinking maybe I had gone too far. Maybe Denise was just happy to have a few quiet days. Maybe everything in my head was just the product of fear in old age. Then 20 minutes passed. I saw my front door open. Denise stepped outside. She looked around very quickly, like an unconscious habit. Then she closed the door, locked it, and walked straight toward Troy's house. Not for a walk, not to go shopping, no large bag, just a few very decisive steps, very familiar with the path. I felt like someone had slammed a fist into my chest. I sat frozen in the car, both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I watched Denise stand in front of Troy's door and knock. She didn't wait long. The door opened almost immediately. Troy appeared. They said something to each other. I couldn't hear it, but I saw Denise smile. a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. Then she stepped inside. The door closed out in that moment. Everything inside me collapsed. Not with a loud explosion, not with screaming, but with a deep, silent shattering, like realizing that the foundation you've stood on your entire life has been rotten for a long time. I felt cold to the bone. An emptiness spread through my body, from my chest to my stomach, then up to my throat. I sat there for a long time. I don't know how long, 5 minutes, 10, half an hour. Time lost its meaning. I just stared at Troy's door, hoping it would open, and at the same time, fearing it would. In my mind, the worst images appeared on their own, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. Finally, I started the car. I drove off, not knowing where I was going. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to keep myself from doing something foolish. I parked in a lot near a shopping center, turned off the engine, and bent forward over the steering wheel. I felt pain. Not sharp pain, but a dull, heavy ache, like a stone pressing on my chest. In that moment, I understood something very clearly. There was no way back. I had seen too much to pretend nothing was happening. I had set the trap, and I had fallen into it myself. If I went home and waited until Friday night as originally planned, I would have to live 2 more days with the image of Denise walking into Troy's house in my head. I knew I couldn't endure that. I checked the time. The afternoon was still long. Denise thought I was in Savannah. She thought I wouldn't be back until the next day. And that thought pushed me into making the final decision of the life I had lived for 34 years. I would go back. No warning, no phone call, no preparation for any explanation. I would return to my house that very day, that very afternoon. Because if the truth was waiting behind that door, I would rather face it immediately than continue running from it in my mind. I started the engine, turned the car around, and drove straight back toward the familiar neighborhood. My heart was racing, but my hands were steady. I knew that when this car stopped in front of the carport, when I stepped into that house, my life, whether I wanted it or not, would move into another chapter. And that chapter would no longer have room for pretending. I drove home in a state I had never experienced before. Not panic, not madness, but a cold, terrifying clarity. Every sound on the road seemed distant. I saw traffic lights change, pedestrians crossing, familiar neighborhood shops, but it all felt like a silent film, no longer connected to me. When my car turned onto the street leading home, my heart began to pound harder. I turned off the engine and sat still for a few seconds in the carport, my hands still on the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, then another, not to gather courage, but to keep myself from losing control. I stepped out of the car and closed the car door like any other day. The house stood there silent. Nothing unusual. No music, no lights on. If it weren't for what I had seen earlier, I might have convinced myself it was all a misunderstanding. I opened the front door and stepped inside. The air in the house felt distinctly different, not because of any smell, but because of the thick silence, a silence with weight pressing on my ears and chest. I called Denise's name out of habit. No answer. I set my keys on the table and took off my jacket. Everything was still in its place. The living room was tidy. The kitchen was clean. But the deeper I went into the house, the more clearly I felt that something that didn't belong there was present. Then I heard the sound. Not loud, not clear voices, but very distinctive, very intimate sounds. The kind of sounds a man who has lived in marriage for more than 30 years can recognize instantly, even if he doesn't want to admit it. My heart tightened. The sound was coming from down the hallway, from my bedroom. Each step down that hallway felt heavy as lead. I moved slowly, not out of fear, but because I needed every second to prepare for what was waiting ahead. The sound faded in and out as if someone were trying to keep it low, but not carefully enough. When I stood in front of the bedroom door, I looked at the doorknob and realized what made my blood run cold. The door was locked from the inside. In 34 years of living together, Denise had never once locked the bedroom door while I was in the house. Never. That door had always been a symbol of shared privacy, of absolute trust that there was nothing to hide. And now, in my own house, in my own room, I was shut out. It wasn't just a locked door. It was the final insult. I knocked. Not hard, not soft. 3 clear knocks. The sound inside stopped abruptly. I called Denise's name. My voice wasn't loud, but I could hear the tremble in it. No one answered. Only hurried, chaotic sounds, a man's whisper, a very soft sound of a zipper being pulled. In that moment, all doubt inside me died completely. There was no more what if, no more maybe. The truth stood solidly in front of me, separated from me by nothing more than a thin wooden door. I placed my hand on the doorknob and turned it, locked tight. I knocked harder. This time, I didn't call her name anymore. I said only one sentence, very low, very slow. Open the door. There was no response from inside, only an artificially crude silence. I stepped back 1 pace. In that moment, I felt a terrifying surge of rage rise up like fire meeting wind. I could break the door down. I could rush in. I could do things I had never imagined I would do in my life. And I broke the door. I don't remember how much force I used. I only remember the sound of wood cracking, metal popping loose from the frame, and the door bursting open with a dull, brutal noise. I stepped inside. What I saw wasn't dramatic like in the movies. There was no screaming, no frantic embrace, just a familiar room distorted. The sheets were tangled. A pillow lay on the floor. The air was heavy with a strange smell. Denise stood there hurriedly, pulling on a robe. Her hair was a mess. Her face had gone pale. She looked at me as if she were staring at a ghost. Her lips moved, but no words came out. I didn't look at her for long. My eyes swept the room the way a man who had inspected hundreds of houses in his life does out of habit. And then I saw it under the bed, a pair of eyes. Troy, he was curled up under there, wearing only his underwear. His face was white as paper, sweat beaded on his forehead. In that moment, I didn't see a man. I saw a creature caught red-handed, stripped of any trace of the decency I had once believed he possessed. The rage inside me exploded violently. I felt every muscle tighten. My hands clenched. In my mind, hundreds of images flashed. Punches, breaking bones, the things people call male instinct. And then it stopped. Not because I was noble, not because I feared the consequences, but because in that exact second, I looked at Troy and realized a raw, undeniable truth. He was not worth me destroying the rest of my life. I looked at him for a long time. I said nothing. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I just looked. That gaze made him tremble. I knew it did because I saw his shoulders flinch slightly. "Get out," I said, my voice low and cold. "Right now." Troy awkwardly crawled out from under the bed. He stood up unsteady, his hands shaking as he grabbed his clothes. He opened his mouth as if to say something. An apology, an explanation, some cheap excuse. I raised my hand. "Don't," I said. "You don't exist enough to speak to me." He froze. He got dressed in panic. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Denise. When he passed by me on his way to the door, I didn't move. I let him walk past as I would let trash carry itself out of the house. When the door closed behind him, the room sank into silence. Denise still stood there, tears spilling over, but there was no sound of crying, just drops falling to the floor, meaningless. I looked around the room once more, the bed I had slept in for more than half my life, the family photo on the dresser. Everything suddenly felt foreign, as if I were standing in a house that had once been mine, but had long since been taken over by someone else. I turned my back. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need reasons, because the moment I saw Troy under the bed, everything was over. There was no dramatic door slamming, no grand declaration, just an ending that was very clear, very cold, and irreversible. My marriage died in that moment, not because of betrayal, but because of contempt. And that is something that can never be healed. The room sank into a thick, suffocating silence, so heavy that each breath felt harder than usual. After Troy disappeared from my house, the space felt as if the air had been drained out of it. Denise stood a few steps away from me, clutching her robe tightly, as if it were the only thing still keeping her upright. I didn't move closer. I didn't step away. I just stood there looking at the woman I had called my wife for 34 years, trying to recognize who she was. In that moment, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pain in the violent way I had imagined. What I felt most clearly was a coldness spreading slowly from my chest to my stomach, then down to my fingertips. The feeling of someone who has walked a very long road only to realize the destination never existed. Denise broke the silence first. Her voice was small, trembling. "Mark, I can explain." I looked at her for a long time, then shook my head. Not a strong shake, just a very small movement, but enough for her to understand that I didn't need any explanation right now. "No," I said. My voice was so calm, it surprised even me. "There's no need to explain anymore." I turned and walked out of the bedroom down the hallway. I heard Denise follow, but she didn't dare come too close. We entered the living room. I sat down in my familiar chair, the one I read the newspaper in every morning. Denise stood across from me, not sitting down, as if sitting would be an insult at this moment. No one spoke for a few minutes. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. I noticed that and found it bitterly ironic. I had always thought that when this moment came, I would collapse, but I didn't. I just felt empty. "How long?" I asked. I didn't look at Denise when I asked. I stared at the wall behind her where an old family photo hung. I wasn't asking out of curiosity. I was asking to measure the depth of the betrayal. I needed to know how long I had been deceived. Denise took a long breath. I heard her swallow. "Almost 2 years," she said. "More than 1.5 years." That answer didn't knock me down instantly. It seeped into me slowly, like cold water soaking through clothes. 2 years, almost 2 years. In my mind, the numbers began stacking themselves. 2 Christmases, 2 birthdays, countless evenings sitting here, believing my wife was at a friend's house, out for a walk, living a harmless life I didn't need to question. I laughed, a short, dry laugh without any joy. Denise flinched, as if that laugh was more frightening than anger. "Almost 2 years," I repeated, turning to look at her. "So for almost 2 years, you looked me in the face every day and lied." Denise lowered her head. Tears began to fall. But I didn't see what I had expected. I didn't see deep remorse. I saw the fear of someone who had been exposed. "I never meant for you to find out," she said, almost whispering. I thought I could control it. Control it. I asked, my voice still even. "Control bringing another man into my bed?" She sobbed. "Mark, please don't say it like that." "Then how should I say it?" I asked back. "Say it gently, so you won't hurt, or should I lie to myself one more time?" Denise sank into the chair across from me, as if her legs could no longer bear her weight. She wiped her face, took a deep breath, and then began to speak, not like a confession, but like a justification prepared long in advance. She said she was lonely, that I was always busy, that I was physically present but emotionally absent, that my tired evenings, my silences, my repetitive habits made her feel invisible. She said Troy listened. Troy cared. Troy made her feel like she was still a woman, not just a part of this house. Each word she spoke was like a slow knife, not sharp, but cutting very deep. I listened. I didn't interrupt, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear it all. I wanted to know how far she would go in turning me into the cause of her betrayal. When Denise finished speaking, the room fell silent again. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't feel angry anymore. The anger had exploded when I saw Troy under the bed. Now it was gone, leaving behind a void so large I didn't know what to call it. Do you know what hurts me the most? I asked, opening my eyes. Denise looked up at me with hopeful eyes, as if my answer might still save something. It's not that you loved someone else, I said slowly. It's that you sit here talking about your loneliness, as if I were the one who pushed you into his arms. She opened her mouth, but I raised my hand. Not angrily, just a sign that I wasn't finished. You're not sorry because you hurt me, I continued. You're sorry because you got caught. If I hadn't come home early today, if that door hadn't been locked, if I hadn't seen him under the bed, you would still be doing it, wouldn't you? Denise stayed silent. That silence answered everything. In that moment, something inside me snapped completely. Not my heart, but the last thread connecting me to the hope that this could be patched up, that with enough love, enough time, enough effort, things could be okay. I stood up. My body felt strangely light, as if I had just put down a burden I had carried for far too long. There are things, I said, not really speaking to Denise, but to myself, that once broken, can't be fixed, not because there isn't enough glue, but because we no longer want to see their old shape. Denise broke down in loud sobs. This time they were real, uncontrolled cries. She called my name. She said she was sorry. She said she would end everything. She said we could go to therapy, start over, forget it all. I heard her, but her words passed through me like wind. Not because I was heartless, but because I had reached a very different place in my mind. A place where for the first time I seriously thought about ending this marriage, not in anger, not to punish anyone, but because I understood that if I stayed, if I tried one more time, I would spend the rest of my life living with the image of the locked door, with the man under the bed, with the words almost 2 years repeating endlessly in my head. I looked at Denise carefully, as if to carve this moment into memory. This woman had once been my entire world, and now she was the one who taught me the most painful lesson of my life. There are truths that, once exposed to the light, leave no path back into the darkness of pretending. I knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. And for the first time since I stepped into this house that afternoon, I was no longer afraid of that God. I didn't call Isaiah immediately after the conversation with Denise. I needed a few minutes, not to reconsider, but to gather the fragments in my head into a story coherent enough to tell my son. I stood by the living room window, looking out at the backyard, where the late afternoon light stretched across the grass. Everything out there was truly peaceful. Inside me, a storm had passed, leaving behind a vast emptiness. When I dialed Isaiah's number, my hand didn't shake. I noticed that and felt both strange and sad. Maybe because the worst had already happened, there was nothing left to fear. The phone rang a few times before my son answered. "Dad," Isaiah said. His voice was the same as always, deep and steady. "Aren't you supposed to be in Savannah?" "I'm not there tonight," I replied. I kept my voice as even as I could. "Can you talk to me for a bit?" There was a very brief pause on the other end of the line, as if Isaiah were adjusting his attention. "Yes, what's going on, Dad?" I took a deep breath. I didn't tell it at length. I didn't go into detail. I said only what needed to be said. That I came home early. That I discovered the truth. That his parents' marriage had come to an end. Each sentence I spoke felt like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples outward. But I didn't stop. Isaiah didn't interrupt me. He didn't blurt out any meaningless exclamations. When I finished speaking, the line on the other end went quiet for a long time. I could hear his breathing, slow and heavy. "Are you okay, Dad?" he finally asked. That question made my throat tighten. Not because of weakness, but because I realized how much my son had grown. He didn't ask what his mother had done. He didn't ask who was right or wrong. He asked whether his father was okay. "I'm still standing," I said. "But I needed you to hear this from me, not from someone else." Isaiah let out a long breath. "I believe you," he said, "and I'm on your side." There were no flowery words of comfort, no grand promises, just a simple sentence. But it was enough to make the heavy weight in my chest lift a little. I thanked him and didn't say much more. Before hanging up, Isaiah said that if I needed anything, if I wanted a place to stay for a while, his home would always have room for me. I acknowledged it, but didn't answer yet not after that. I called Jasmine. This call was harder. Jasmine was more like Denise than Isaiah, not in personality, but in the way emotions flowed through her. When I said I needed to talk, her voice immediately tightened. I told the story briefly, the same way I had told Isaiah. On the other end of the line, Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't press me with questions. She was just silent. That silence said everything. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jasmine said after a long moment. Her voice grew smaller. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "I just need you to know." "I'm with you, Dad," Jasmine said. This time, I heard the catch in her throat. "I'll come see you soon." When I hung up, it was fully dark outside. The house lights were on. I went back to the living room where Denise had been sitting the whole time. She looked at me with a questioning expression, as if each phone call were a pair of scissors, slowly cutting the last thread still connecting us. I stood in front of Denise. No anger, no shouting. I spoke as if I were reading a conclusion I had thought through very carefully. "It's over," I said. "We're not going to argue. We're not going to blame each other, but there won't be any more chances either." Denise sprang to her feet. She began to cry, this time with uncontrolled sobs. She said my name. She said she was sorry. She talked about marriage counseling, about starting over, about the years we had shared. She said it was just a mistake, that she had ended everything with Troy, that she was willing to do anything to keep this family together. I listened, but nothing inside me moved, not because I had no feelings left, but because I had passed the point where turning back was possible. Those promises, if they had been spoken before the bedroom door was locked, before I saw the man under the bed, might have meant something. Now they were just sounds. "I'm no longer able to believe those words," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't emphasize anything. I simply spoke the truth. And a marriage without trust is no longer a marriage. Denise dropped to her knees in front of me. That image hurt me in a very different way. Not out of pity, but because I could see clearly the desperation of someone who had just lost everything. She grabbed my hands, crying and begging. I pulled my hands away slowly but firmly. "We're no longer on the same path," I said. Staying together now would only hurt us both more. Those words were like a final cut. Denise collapsed into the chair, crying without sound. I turned away, not because I was cruel, but because if I looked 1 second longer, I might waver. And I didn't allow myself to do that. That night, I carried a pillow and blanket into the guest bedroom, the master bedroom, the room that had once symbolized our family. I didn't step into again. I lay on the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. And for the first time in many years, I slept alone in my own house. Sleep didn't come easily. Memories surged in waves. Denise when she was young on our wedding day. The children's laughter when they were small. Evenings when the whole family sat together. The sense of loss rose like a tide, slow but relentless. I felt pain. I felt emptiness. I felt as if a part of my life had been torn away. But beneath all of that, there was something that didn't waver. My decision was solid as stone. I knew I would face many difficult days ahead. I knew there would be moments when I wondered whether I could endure the loneliness. But I also knew that returning to a marriage broken at its foundation would be far more painful. In the darkness of the small room, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. 34 years had passed. A long chapter of my life had closed. And no matter how painful it was, I didn't regret choosing the truth over continuing to live inside a lie. The next morning, I woke up very early, not because of an alarm, but because my body was used to never allowing itself to sleep in. The pale morning light slipped through the crack in the guest bedroom window, illuminating the bare wall. For the first few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the memories rushed back uninvited, the locked door, the man under the bed, last night's conversation, the decision that couldn't be undone. I sat up, put my feet on the floor, and realized something strange. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't falling apart. I was just tired. A very deep exhaustion, as if I had walked hundreds of miles overnight. That was the first day of my life I had to meet a lawyer because of my own marriage. I used to think things like that only happened to other people, to unfamiliar families, to names in newspapers, or side conversations. Not to me, not to a man who had lived his whole life by principles, who believed that patience and responsibility were enough to hold everything together. The lawyer's office was in an old building in Midtown Atlanta. I sat in the waiting room, looking around at the pale gray walls, the worn leather chairs, and a stack of magazines I didn't bother to open. When I was invited in, I shook the lawyer's hand. A middle-aged man with a calm voice and eyes accustomed to hearing broken stories. He asked why I was there, and I began to tell him. I told everything in a voice so dry that even I found it unfamiliar, as if I were talking about another man. I talked about 34 years of marriage, about betrayal, about discovering the truth. There were no tears, no emotional outbursts, just facts laid out one after another, bare and exhausting. The lawyer listened, occasionally jotting down a few notes. When I finished, he leaned back and let out a quiet breath. Legally, he said, you have the advantage. I nodded. I already knew that to some extent. The house was in my name. Most of the assets were as well. Those details were spoken calmly, professionally, but none of them made me feel like I had won. Legal advantage didn't lighten my heart. It didn't compensate for the sense of loss. It didn't erase the image of the years that had passed. It was simply another cold fact in a chain of truths I was forced to accept. When I left the lawyer's office, I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, breathing in the midday air. The city was still noisy. People were still rushing. The world's life didn't stop just because mine had cracked open. I understood that very clearly. I drove back to the house I knew I wouldn't be able to call home for much longer. That afternoon, I began dividing my belongings. I had thought it would be simple, just choosing a few things to take, leaving the rest behind. But when I stood in front of the closet, in front of drawers that had held an entire lifetime, I realized how wrong I was. Every item carried a memory. Every shirt, every pair of shoes was tied to some moment. I opened a small drawer where I kept my most personal things. Inside was my father's old watch, the one he gave me on the day I married Denise. The leather strap was worn, the glass scratched, but I had never thrown it away. I picked up the watch, clenched it in my hand, and felt a lump rise in my throat. It belonged to me, to the line of men in my family. I placed it in my suitcase carefully. I took out old photographs, wedding photos, pictures of Isaiah and Jasmine, as children standing in front of the house on a summer morning. I didn't look at each one closely. I skimmed them as if looking longer would make me collapse. I chose a few, wrapped them up, and set them aside. Downstairs, I could hear Denise moving around. She didn't come into my room. She knew that boundary had been drawn the night before. But later in the afternoon, when I rolled my suitcase into the living room, she was standing there waiting. Mark, she said, her voice tired. Can we talk? I looked at her, then shook my head. Not because I hated her, but because I knew that if I started talking, I would be pulled back into a useless loop. Not now, I replied. If there's anything to say it through the lawyers. Denise broke down crying. She said I was too cold, that I was acting like a stranger. I didn't respond. I simply lifted my suitcase and walked toward the door. Each step felt like pulling an invisible thread that connected me to this house. Stretching it until it finally snapped. I drove away in the glow of the sunset. I didn't look back. I didn't check the rearview mirror. I carried a few suitcases, an entire life compressed into a few pieces of luggage. The new apartment I rented was in a quiet neighborhood near Decatur. Small, simple, nothing special. White walls, cold wooden floors, one bedroom, a living room, a small kitchen. When I opened the door and stepped inside, the echo of my own footsteps made me realize just how empty it was. I set the suitcases down, sat on the only chair in the living room, and looked around. No family photos, no decorations, no trace of a life once shared. Just me and an unfamiliar space. That first night, I ate a simple dinner, a sandwich I grabbed on the way. I stood in the kitchen while eating, not bothering to set the table. When I was done, I washed my hands, turned off the lights, and went into the bedroom. I lay on the new bed, the sheets still smelling of new fabric. The ceiling here was lower. There were none of the familiar sounds of the old house, no sound of Denise turning in her sleep, no wind slipping through cracks I had grown used to hearing for years. That was when I understood what real loneliness was. Not the kind of loneliness of evenings spent watching TV alone while your spouse is out. Not something temporary, but a deep emptiness when you realize you have stepped into an entirely different chapter of life and no one else is standing on the same side of the room with you. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the dark ceiling. I thought about the years that had passed, about the right and wrong decisions, about whether I could have done anything differently. But eventually, those questions quieted. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. The pain was still there. The loss was still there. But beneath it all was a truth I couldn't deny. I had chosen the harder path, but it was the honest one. And in that cold, lifeless apartment, I began to accept that this was the starting point of the rest of my life. A life in which I would have to learn to live with the truth. No matter how cold it might be, the days that followed moved so slowly that I began to doubt my own sense of time. Morning followed morning, but there were no markers to distinguish one day from the next. I woke up very early, out of habit carved deep over decades. But when I opened my eyes, I no longer knew what I was waking up early for. The small apartment was silent. There were no footsteps but my own. No soft cough from someone in the kitchen. No sound of water running in the next bathroom. I made coffee. The familiar smell spreading through the empty space. But for the first time in my life, it didn't comfort me. I took a few sips and left it on the table. Cold. The things that once gave me a sense of stability now felt meaningless. I turned on the TV, flipped through news channels, sports, programs I used to watch every night. Nothing held my attention for more than a few minutes. I turned the TV off. The room fell back into silence. I went outside for walks, thinking the air and movement might lighten my mind. I walked around the neighborhood, looking at identical houses, neatly trimmed lawns, cars parked neatly in front of driveways. There were elderly couples watering plants together, talking slowly. I walked past them, feeling as if I were moving through a world I had just been exiled from. Sometimes I stopped at the small park near the apartment, sitting on a wooden bench, watching children run and play. Their laughter rang out clear and unburdened. I remembered Isaiah and Jasmine when they were young. I remembered afternoons taking them to the park. Remembered Denise standing at a distance, calling them back when it started to get dark. Those memories came naturally, without effort and without asking my permission. And each time they came, they left behind a quiet ache, not violent, but persistent, like a bruise that never quite healed. But slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a moment of revelation. It was gradual, like the way dawn creeps in before you realize the night has passed. I started accepting the silence. I started finding small routines. I learned to cook simple meals for myself. I started reading books I had never had time for. I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with over the years. Isaiah and Jasmine visited often. They brought food, sat with me, talked about their lives. They never pushed me to talk about Denise, but they were always there when I needed them. And in those moments, sitting with my children, I realized something important. I hadn't lost everything. The parts of my life that truly mattered. My children, my integrity, my sense of self, those were still intact. One afternoon, about 3 months after I moved out, I was sitting on my small balcony drinking coffee when my phone rang. It was Isaiah. "Dad," he said, "I wanted to ask you something." "What is it?" I asked. "Would you want to come over for dinner this Sunday? The grandkids have been asking about you." I felt something warm spread through my chest, a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. "Of course," I said. I'd love that Sunday. I drove to Isaiah's house. When I walked in, my grandchildren ran to me, hugging my legs, shouting, "Grandpa, Grandpa." I bent down and hugged them back, and in that moment, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. Purpose, connection, a reason to keep moving forward. We sat around the table, ate dinner, laughed at the kids' stories. Isaiah's wife asked me how I was doing, and for the first time, I could answer honestly. "I'm doing okay," I said. "It's been hard, but I'm doing okay." On the drive home that night, I realized something profound. My life hadn't ended when my marriage did. It had simply changed direction. The road ahead looked different from what I had imagined, but it was still a road, and I was still walking. The divorce papers came a few months later. I signed them in the lawyer's office, my hand steady. When I walked out into the bright Atlanta sunshine, I felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but lighter. As if I had been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there until it was gone. I started volunteering at a community center, helping teach construction skills to young men who wanted to learn a trade. It felt good to use my hands again, to teach, to give back. I made new friends. I found new purposes. I learned that life doesn't end at 65, even when everything you thought was permanent falls apart. One evening, almost a year after everything happened, I was sitting on my balcony watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was warm and still. I thought about Denise. I thought about the years we shared, the good and the bad. And for the first time, I felt something other than anger or pain. I felt acceptance. What happened had happened. I couldn't change it. I couldn't go back. But I could choose how to move forward. And I chose to move forward with dignity, with honesty, with the values my father taught me. I chose to live the rest of my life on my own terms, not defined by betrayal, but by the strength it took to walk away from it. I picked up my phone and called Isaiah. When he answered, I said something I hadn't been able to say for a long time. "I'm proud of you, son. I'm proud of the man you've become." There was a pause on the other end, and then Isaiah's voice, thick with emotion. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." When I hung up, I looked out at the sunset one more time. The sky was darkening, stars beginning to appear. And I realized that even in the darkest nights, there is always light if you're willing to look for it. My marriage was over. That chapter of my life had closed. But I was still here, still breathing, still standing. And that, I finally understood, was enough. Thank you for being here and letting me share my story. If it touched you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling me what city and state you're watching from. I love knowing where you all are. If you want to support me even more, there's a donation link in the description. I share real-life stories like this every single day. And now, 2 of my most popular videos will appear on your screen. Choose whichever one calls to you. Until next time, remember, your story isn't over just because someone tried to write the ending without you.